thank everyone, all of the organizations who are sponsoring today's webinar, including Nonviolence International, ICNC, the Mambrú Foundation, the Citizen Laboratory in Venezuela, Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, CEPA and Flaxo.
Quiero también agradecer especialmente a uno de los organizadores, que es el programa regional, el Instituto Regional para el estudio y la práctica de la acción noviolenta estratégica en las Américas, que tenemos aquí a Belén, que sirve de intérprete, pero que es la directora del instituto, y bueno, varios de nosotros somos parte del instituto, y más adelante podremos como conversar también un poquito de lo que ha hecho el Instituto Regional. Entonces quiero empezar presentándoles Michael. Michael es un amigo mío, de hecho, desde hace varios años. Y Michael ha sido director de la ONG Nonviolence International desde 1998. Es un activista global y bueno, un activista global por los derechos humanos, los derechos de las minorías y en contra de las guerras y el capitalismo de casino. También es formador de activistas y lo ha sido en muchos países, como Birmania, por ejemplo, Kosovo, Tibet, Indonesia, Tailandia, Camboya, India, Zimbabue y los Estados Unidos. También Michael habla con frecuencia sobre los temas de la no violencia y ha participado en entrevistas en cadenas como CNN, y él y su pareja, la Tanja, tienen 2 hijos. El libro que va a presentar Michael hoy se origina en el pedido desde hace 2 décadas de actualizar el libro de Gene Sharp titulado The Politics of Nonviolent Action, en el cual Sharp introdujo 3 categorías de métodos no violentos e identificó 198 métodos o tácticas específicos. Como nadie hizo esta actualización, a pesar de que Michael no es académico, sino es un activista como dijimos, y un formador de activista, decidió asumir ese reto. Y hace 10 años atrás, la organización Nonviolence International empezó a recopilar ejemplos que ahora son parte de una base de datos llamada Global Nonviolent Tactics Database. Y les voy a compartir en el enlace ahorita mediante el chat, para que puedan verlo. Ahí sí me dicen que voy muy rápido, disculpen, siempre me olvido que estamos traduciendo. Aquí está el link de la base de datos. Y esta base de datos, o sea, gracias a esta base de datos y a este esfuerzo por recopilar tácticas de resistencia civil, la organización de Michael logró identificar 350 tácticas de resistencia no violenta. Thanks to this database of nonviolent tactics, Michael's organization has identified 350 esta gran variedad de tácticas. Really showcase the decirles también que hace 5 años la ONG ICNC, cuyo presidente Hardy va a dar unas palabras casi enseguida sobre el libro antes de que Michael empiece su presentación. Entonces, ICNC le pidió a Michael escribir un libro para actualizar esa lista de métodos y tácticas propuestas por Sharp en los años 70. Entonces, el libro que del cual vamos a escuchar la presentación hoy es el resultado de todo ese esfuerzo. No quiero yo ahondar en el contenido del libro porque me imagino que todos quieren escuchar esto del propio Michael. Solo quiero decirles que es un libro relativamente corto, en acceso libre, traducido al español, con muchísimo material que provee tanto preguntas como respuestas y nos ayuda a entender cómo aparecieron nuevas tácticas de resistencia no violenta y también toda la variedad de tácticas de resistencia no violenta que se implementan en la actualidad. Entonces, sin más, le voy a dar la palabra a Hardy,
So now I'd like
presidente de
to
ICNC,
recognize
quien fue
Hardy
quien
Merriman of
invitó a Michael
ICNC and ask
a
him
asumir
to give
este
a
reto hace
welcome on
5
behalf
años.
of ICNC.
Hardy, puedes empezar con tu presentación del libro.
You can go ahead and start, Hardy.
Great. Thank you, Cecile. It's great to be with everyone today. Thank you for coming. You know, in 1973, Gene Sharp published his major book, The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And here we are 50 years later. And finally, somebody has expanded officially with a big comprehensive list of methods, has expanded beyond Gene Sharp's 198. Gene's work has been very influential. Over the years, it has produced it has been like a foundation for the field of nonviolent action to grow. His initial list of tactics, 198 tactics, he split into 3 categories. Nonviolent protest and persuasion was the first category. The second was non-cooperation, where he said basically there's economic and social and political ways that people cannot cooperate. And then the third category was nonviolent intervention. These are things like blockades, where people actually physically block something from happening. And then over the next 5 decades, people have critiqued Sharp, they have praised Sharp. There are probably about easily 10 different ways we can organize tactics beyond those 3 I just gave you. Numerous scholars and activists have advanced them. But again,
ir adelante con ellas, desarrollarlas, pero no sé si uno o alguien
comprehensively tried to update this list of tactics. Many people documented new tactics, but no one's, I don't know of many who said, I'm going to actually produce a publication adding hundreds more to the list. And Michael has done that. And it's a huge service to the field, and it's a huge service to practitioners. When actually, as I recall, Michael proposed the project to ICNC. And I remember thinking that this was going to be a big project, and it did. It stretched on for years. I think longer than you thought it would, right, Michael? Longer than the initial estimate, but it was worth it. Michael did an amazing job drawing from scholars and practitioners and his deep, deep knowledge from lived experience of 40 years in this field, Michael? 40 years. Michael's dedicated his life to this field. And it comes across, the love and the labor comes across in this work, Michael, so thank you. I know we're behind on time, so I will only make a couple other quick comments and then pass to Michael, but I would say thank you also to the translators of this book and to the translators today. One of the things about identifying new tactics of nonviolent action, in many cases, we have to make up terms in English to describe them. I can imagine it's very challenging to translate them, to translate them into other languages, because many times we had to create words in English to refer to them. So thank you for your incredibly valuable work. And then lastly, just thank you to the Regional Institute for Nonviolent Action in the Americas and to all who have co-sponsored today's event. I really appreciate this convening, and let's get on with it. Michael, we want to hear you. Thank you.
Michael, todo tuyo. Entonces, estamos todos atentos ahora a tu presentación. Muchas gracias, Hardy, por estas palabras y por el apoyo a esta iniciativa, sin la cual pues no podríamos tener hoy esta presentación. Michael, se desapareció tu presentación.
Your presentation disappeared.
Ahora sí. Perfecto. Adelante, Michael.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Hardy, for that lovely introduction and for your support for this book and project for many years. Thank you, Hardy and ICNC, for the incredible work that you've done to advance the field of nonviolent action and civil resistance all around the world. No organization has had such a big impact as yours in the field. And we wish you all the best going forward and look forward working with you. So thanks again for all your work. And thank you for the hosts here and the co-sponsoring organizations. We are very excited about the fact that there is a regional network, Acción Noviolenta in las Américas. It's a long time coming, and we really need your leadership in the region and internationally. So it's an honor to speak with you, and I hope I'm not speaking too quickly. I'll try to slow down. Today I will speak about the book that is a free download for you on our website, both in Spanish and in English. And I look forward to you engaging with us in the future, with me, asking questions, coming up with new ideas. Because one of the things that I've learned from the book is that I now have more questions than I have answers. And I think you will also have more questions than answers when you finish reading this book. So I will give you a brief presentation today, and I look forward to your questions on this call and afterwards. Briefly, Nonviolence International is a global organization, and we support and promote nonviolent action around the world. We have a lovely website and the global database of nonviolent tactics that we invite you to go to. It is mostly in English, so I apologize that we're not as multilingual as we should be for a global group. Why did I write a book on nonviolent tactics, and why create a database? Well, as you heard, we've been stuck at 198 methods for 50 years, and we needed to update it. And so we took it upon ourselves to do that. It's now at about 360 tactics and growing. And the database is on our website. We'll put it in the chat later, the link to that. We want to update the framework. It wasn't just a question of collecting more tactics. We also wanted to update Gene Sharp's framework to reflect in the categories of nonviolence, to reflect the enormous universe of nonviolent action in the world today. And we wanted to understand better how nonviolent works, and we think we've succeeded in understanding a little better. Civil resistance, and this is the academic definition here at the beginning here that is, I'll read to you. It's hopefully the rest of the slideshow will be much easier to get through. Civil resistance is an extra institutional conflict waging strategy in which organized grassroots movements use various nonviolent tactics such as strikes, boycotts, demonstrations, non-cooperation, self-organizing, and constructive resistance to fight perceived injustice without the threat or use of violence. That's a lot of words, but it's an enormous field, and that's why we're having this specific definition. Nonviolent action or direct action intends to exert power in a society without causing physical harm. Tactics or nonviolent methods or tactics specifically can't be routine or institutional processes with known procedural outcomes, such as the laws or courts, elections, lobbying, and commerce. You say commerce. Well, commerce is about exchange. I give you something, you give me money. Usually it's money. So that's a known outcome. You don't know necessarily what the specifics are, but the known outcome is exchange, something for something else. Money, usually. Another And so people confuse nonviolent action with commerce or with lobbying or elections. No, this is not what we call nonviolent action, at least in this book. It's true, elections are an institutional nonviolent way to shift power and to create, get new leadership in a society. And that's great. But we're specifically here talking about civil resistance and nonviolent action outside of institutional norms. I hope that's helpful to make sense. We're also saying that tactics must not be primarily logistical campaign activities such as training and fundraising. Those are the support efforts that you need to then do direct action or go out and do civil resistance. And finally, we're saying here in this book that nonviolent action must be unilateral and does not require the cooperation of an adversary. There is controversy around this last point. The great Stellan Windhagen has written a book about nonviolence, and he proposes that nonviolence is actually not unilateral, but is, what's the word, bilateral or dialogical is the term he uses, dialogical, and he makes a good argument for that. But in this case, I'm presenting it as a unilateral action here. How do nonviolent tactics function? This is a really fascinating little piece in the book, and you won't read this almost anywhere else because it hasn't really been presented to the public before or the field. How does nonviolent tactics actually work? And what I've come up with is a dualistic explanation of how nonviolent tactics work. They work either through coercion or confrontation, or they work through persuasion or constructive action. And the coercion means threats and costs that you might impose on an adversary or an opponent. And persuasion are appeals, rewards, or what I call competitive modeling. I can explain that more, of the future that you want, and that you get society to do things the way you and your group want your society to act. So this dualistic understanding of nonviolent tactics builds very nicely on Gene Sharp and others' work, because number one, you see on the list here of the screen, is about controlling resources or manipulating resources. And so you can either manipulate resources coercively, or you can manipulate or control resources persuasively. And the three major ways of controlling resources or manipulating resources, or what are through what we say or expression. We control or manipulate resources through doing or acts of commission or creating. And we also control resources by not doing something, by withholding or withdrawing our cooperation and refusing to do something or don't do something. And so this simple framework is trying to encapsulate the enormous field of nonviolent action, which is going on every single day in the world, in every single country. It is a massive phenomenon that we have going. There are protests and non-cooperation going on every day in every single country, including the most repressive countries like North Korea. every single day, there is nonviolent resistance going on. And so we're trying to come up with a very broad categories and understanding of how does this all work. And this is how we came to understand that nonviolent tactics work. And we build the categories based on these functions of how nonviolence works. I hope that's clear through translation or even in English, what I just said. I have sorry, my screen is not adequate for what you're supposed to see here. We'll put the chart also in the chat. This chart is mostly here. You can mostly see it. It basically takes these functions of nonviolent action, and we categorize all nonviolent action through these functions. On the left-hand side are the controlling of resources in terms of what we say. Oops, yeah, I can't scroll down. I'm sorry, I apologize for this slide. The bottom is haciendo, I guess, intervention. So you can see down the side what we say, what we do, and what we don't do. And across the top are the positive and the negative, or the persuasive and the coercive ways of acting. And so we have basically encapsulated or fulfilled the entire field of nonviolent action in this. One of the unusual things that emerged in this categories that when we created this chart is the category here called cooperation, also called refraining or abstenerse, I guess, abstaining. It's a category that we need somebody on this call to write a master's degree thesis or a PhD thesis on, because nobody's actually looked at this category of action before. It's a category of action that's a small category, but it's been around for a while. And it's called, example is halting or calling off a planned or ongoing action to reward or persuade, such as suspending a strike. For example, this has happened in many countries, but in the United States, in Philadelphia, there was a transit strike of the transportation system. And the workers went on strike in the evening at rush hour. And everybody was thinking in the morning there was going to be more strike. But the union, the syndicate, they called off, they suspended their strike in the morning as a goodwill gesture to the public and to the authorities, and said, we will suspend our strike and negotiate some more. They didn't have to do this, but it was an act of, they stopped what they were doing. So this is why we included in this line of no haciendo, and it's a constructive action. And nobody has studied these strategy, or these, call it tactics, of suspending a strike or whatnot, and taken a look at this category of nonviolent action before. And I hope somebody on this call might be looking for a PhD doctoral thesis and might want to explore that category of nonviolent action. Why update Gene Sharp's work? Well, we've all heard that nobody had updated in this 50 years. And you can read through here. There are lots of changes in 50 years. Technology has expanded. The arts and the cultural resistance field has exploded in the last 50 years and was not well documented by Sharp in the first place. The human rights field really emerged in the 1970s. And frankly, a lot of people in the world don't consider themselves nonviolent activists so much anymore. They consider themselves human rights defenders. And the human rights frame in many places has overtaken the nonviolence frame for organizers around the world. And there's a lot of overlap, huge overlap between the two. But there have been creative additions to nonviolent tactics by the human rights defenders. And there's a whole website on human rights tactics that's similar to ours. It's marvelous. Human rights tactics. You can look that up. I think it's only in English. Other things listed here. Obviously, the women's movement and gender minority, sexual minority movements have grown in the last 50 years and have contributed greatly to new kinds of nonviolent tactics. So it's an exciting field to watch and to be involved with. And I'm going to go through now and give some examples of nonviolent tactics that in the last 50 years that we see that we have added to the list. And what we hope to do is inspire all of you to collect nonviolent tactics and to send them to us so we can add them to the database. And we want people around the world to know that there are hundreds of things that they can potentially do, that the toolbox of nonviolent action is enormous and very creative. Flash mob. This is a protest in Malaysia during the Occupy movement. And this is a form of acting where people very quickly gather. Because of digital communication, they're able to get together very quickly and mobilize very rapidly. One of the things that we've learned in recent years is that, yes, we can get the society in certain cases to mobilize in very large numbers, but mobilization is often not enough to win. Usually one tactic is not enough to win. You have to do a sequence of tactics in a campaign to win most struggles. You can look at the Arab Spring and see the example where they had millions of people in the streets 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and in many cases they did not win, even though they were enabled to shake things up for a time and get a lot of people mobilized. But mobilize for one tactic is usually not enough to win, but it is an important tool to use. And let's just keep moving through examples. Growing or cutting hair. Recently, you can see the picture on the one side where the woman is holding up the hair she cut from Iran, where the feminist movement is fighting back against the patriarchal government that requires them to wear scarves. Cacerolazo, I hope my Spanish was okay there. This was actually, to the best of our knowledge, invented in Chile in 1971 by women in Chile. That's our earliest record of this tactic being done, and it's been copied all over the world. One of the most recent examples is in Burma or Myanmar, where the citizens banged on pots and pans in the night to scare off the police and the army, and to also notify the neighbors and everybody when there was a raid of their community. Digital games. There are many digital games, recently some invented in Hong Kong to help people learn how to resist the Beijing takeover of Hong Kong and the squashing of democracy there. Murals. This is actually not such a new tactic, but Gene Sharp hadn't listed this in his 198. And this is, of course, something that we see all over the world. The Mexicans, of course, are particularly proud of their murals and their famous muralist. This is something called, oh, you have a word for it in Spanish. In English and French, it's called surveillance or surveillance. This is the opposite of what the government does. The government surveils us, but the people surveil from below. We surveil the corporations and the government. And here you can see people are videoing and taking photos of police who are abusing protesters in Brazil. And there's a big contest in the world between governments and people movements. The governments are using surveillance and cameras to try to control people, and the people are using cameras to fight back against the authorities. The best known example of this is recently in the United States when George Floyd was killed in Minnesota by the police. There was a young teenage woman who videoed it on her cell phone, and the police told her to stop, and she refused to cooperate and continued to film his murder. And when she shared that around the world, there was a great uprising. So surveillance, or you can see the Spanish version of it here, of that great new word, and work by people. I hope I'm not going too fast for the translators. Another tactic is suspending of religious rights. This example is from Myanmar or Burma, where Buddhist monks refused to cooperate with the military generals and the junta that had taken over the country. They turned their bowls upside down and refused to cooperate with the regime. Divestment is a tactic that was invented in the 1970s, primarily in the United States, but other places as well. It was started with the South African apartheid movement, and divestment is where shareholders of corporations that can be either private individuals or pension funds, they withdraw their money, their ownership from these corporations. This is actually not an economically powerful thing to do because somebody else just becomes the owner. But it is a very good way to protest and express yourself and to get attention. So divestment is a very good attention-getting tactic. It should not be confused with disinvestment. I don't know how to make the distinction in Spanish between divestment and disinvestment, but disinvestment is where the corporations actually pull out of a country. And for example, you've seen a lot of that in Russia, where a lot of corporations did not want to be associated with the Russian government and actually withdrew their corporation from the country. That's called disinvestment. That has a much more powerful economic impact. This is the suspension tactic that we referred to briefly earlier. Here's an example of a tactic of people, of professors, teachers, suspending a 6-day walkout in Arizona, which is a state in the United States. Die-in is something invented in the last 50 years. Some of you participated in this. We often throw fake blood, or some people throw real blood on ourselves or around and add additional props or additional articles to communicate the fact that people have been killed. And this is a very theatrical, of course, tactic that's very commonly used. Invocation of magic. This was done a few years ago, 2 years ago in Myanmar or Burma. And you can see across the street are sarongs or longji. I don't know how they're pronounced in Spanish or said, but this is what women and men wear. But in this case, these are all women's sarongs that are being hung out, supposedly to get cleaned or dry out. They've been cleaned, but the superstition in Myanmar is that if men walk under a woman's clothing, that they will lose their power, their masculinity. And so women hung up these clothing across the street to prevent the army or the police from walking under and going into that neighborhood. And this was quite successful in some cases. Critical mass rides. This is something that I think you've seen in various parts of the world where people are trying to create the future today. I talked about competitive modeling earlier. And this is also in political science language. This is called prefigurative action. This is where you act out the future today. So these cyclists are trying to create the new world today, a new world that does not have automobiles, but is a world of bicycles and cycles. And so they are creating the world today through their action. This is one of the most powerful kinds of nonviolent action, is prefigurative action, competitive modeling action, and this critical mass is one example. So I'm going to wrap up here. I've been talking for a while. Effective nonviolent action requires a really good understanding of tactics and training. Nonviolence is still being understood because it's happening in so many countries, in so many circumstances, on such a huge scale. We're certainly learning all the time. Please use our books and classes in your classroom, and I'm happy if you can translate to come to your classrooms and speak to them about nonviolent tactics. And I will just say that chapter 6 is an interesting chapter that I invite you to read. I talk about a lot of the controversies in nonviolent action today. It's a dynamic field, and sometimes it's not always clear what is included in civil resistance and nonviolent action and what is not. And I have a brief explanation of some of these complicated areas that we should learn about and study about, because they are often used in certain kinds of resistance movements, and we need to learn and know about them. I have now concluded my long presentation. I hope this was helpful for you today. I'm eager to hear your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, Michael, por esta excelente presentación. Realmente uno siempre aprende de ti, así que muchas gracias por compartir toda esa experiencia y hacernos partícipes, ¿no?, de estas interesantes tácticas que tú encontraste gracias a todo ese trabajo de muchos años de recopilación, ¿no?, de tácticas para actualizar el trabajo de Sharp. Entonces, vamos ahora a iniciar con las preguntas y respuestas. Les recuerdo a todos que tienen que colocar sus preguntas o comentarios a través de la opción de preguntas y respuestas que se encuentra abajo de su pantalla. Y mientras ustedes se vayan animando haciendo sus preguntas, voy a dar la palabra a Belén, que quería hacer un comentario general. Entonces, Belén,
while everyone's thinking about your questions, I'll turn it over to Belén for a brief response.
¿Escucha? Sí. Muchas gracias, Michael, por tu excelente presentación.
Thank you, Michael, for your excellent presentation.
Tu libro es un aporte inmenso a los estudios sobre resistencia civil
Without any doubt,
tenerlo en español
your book is an immense
permite que este
contribution to
conocimiento
studies
llegue
of
a todos
civil
los
resistance.
países del habla hispana.
And having it in Spanish allows this
Recomendamos en
knowledge
especial
to
este
reach
libro,
all
el
Spanish
cual
speaking
comienza con la
countries.
introducción de términos y conceptos
We
fundamentales en la
highly recommend
resistencia
this
civil,
book, which begins with an
seguidos
introduction
de
to fundamental terms
tendencias
and
y
concepts in
factores
civil resistance,
subyacentes que impulsan el crecimiento de nuevas
followed by
tácticas de
underlying trends
resistencia
and
civil en
factors
todo el
driving
mundo.
the growth of new
También
civil
identifica las
resistance tactics
deficiencias de la
around the world.
categorización actual de las
It also
tácticas y ofrece una
identified
lista
gaps in
ampliada
the way we
de
currently
nuevas tácticas,
categorize
así como un marco
tactics.
refinado para
It offers us an
catalogarlas.
expanded list of new tactics, as
Finalmente
well
ofrece
as a refined
conclusiones
framework
claras para
for
activistas
categorizing
y
them.
practicantes, expertos,
Finally, it offers
investigadores de
clear
campo y
conclusions
otras
for
personas
activists and
interesadas en apoyar los
practitioners,
movimientos no
experts,
violentos de
researchers in the
manera
field,
efectiva.
and
El
others
Instituto
interested in
Regional para el
supporting
Estudio y
nonviolent
Prácticas de la
movements
Acción Noviolenta
effectively.
Estratégica en las Américas, que es una
The
alianza
Regional
entre dos
Institute for the
instituciones
Study and
académicas
Practice of
del Ecuador,
Strategic
Flaxo,
Nonviolent Action
UCE
in the
y la
Americas,
ONG
is an
Sempro.
alliance between two
Buscan
Ecuadorian
promover un
academic
aprendizaje
institutions,
sostenible
Flaxo
en
and
el estudio y
PUSE,
la práctica de la acción no
and
violenta
the NGO Simproc,
en
which
América
seeks to
Latina y el
promote
Caribe,
sustainable
y
learning
este
in the study
webinar,
and practice
sin lugar a
of
dudas, contribuye a esta
nonviolent
misión.
action, strategic nonviolence
Nuestra
in Latin
plataforma
America and the
virtual
Caribbean.
busca
And this
fomentar el
webinar
intercambio de
undoubtedly contributes
experiencias
to
a
that
través de
message.
diferentes mecanismos
So our
como
virtual
este webinar.
platform seeks to promote the
Esperamos que
exchange
con
of
este evento
experiences through
hayamos
different
contribuido a la
mechanisms,
difusión
such
de
as
la
this
teoría
webinar.
y la práctica de
We
la
hope
acción no
that with this
violenta
event, we've
y se
contributed
fomente
to
la
the
construcción de una
dissemination of
red
theory and
dinámica
practice
regional de
of
activistas de base y
nonviolent action,
académicos
and
interesados
that'll
y o
foster a
involucrados
dynamic
en el
regional
estudio.
network of grassroots
Muchas gracias,
activists and
Cecilia.
academics who are interested or
Muchísimas
involved in study
gracias,
and
Belén.
practice of nonviolent
Por si
strategic
acaso,
action.
Priyanka nos está
Thank you, Belén.
compartiendo algunos links que pueden
At
ser de
this point,
interés
you'll notice in the
del
chat that
programa
Priyanka is
del
sharing a
Instituto
number of links that you
Regional
can learn
para el
more
estudio
about
y la práctica
nonviolent
de la
action
acción no
in the
violenta
Americas,
estratégica en las
including
Américas. Perdón que
our blog,
yo digo
podcast,
varias veces
social
programa
media.
porque así nos llamábamos cuando empezamos, pero hemos crecido ahora y nos hemos vuelto un instituto con
We have,
varios ámbitos.
I keep
como lo
referring to
pueden
it as
ver
program, but we have
los
now
links.
grown
Nos han llegado algunas
and
preguntas, entonces,
into a complete
Michael,
institute.
si te parece bien, voy a empezar con las tres
So,
primeras.
Michael,
Yo
at
creo
this
que
point,
si tú puedes
if it's
manejar
okay with
tres
you, I'll
preguntas de
start with
una
the first three questions
para que
and
tengas
collect them and then
las
have a round of
preguntas. La
responses.
primera,
The first one
que nos pregunta Joel,
from
¿cómo
Joel.
estructurarías un movimiento desde cero?
So how would you structure a movement starting from
y la
scratch?
Segunda,
And
del
how do
mismo
we
Joel,
protect
¿cómo
ourselves
protegernos
from
como movimientos de la
retaliation,
represión o de la
repression,
violencia? Y ahí
or
pregunta
violence,
Joel específicamente
especially
de manera internacional. Entonces, me imagino que se refiere al apoyo que los movimientos pueden tener a nivel internacional para protegerse de
the international support that movements can draw and to protect
y te voy a hacer una pregunta más. Hay más en el chat, pero voy a ir para que sea solo tres para empezar, para no hacerte demasiadas preguntas de una. Nos dice Catherine.
So
gracias,
Catherine's
Michael.
is in
Catherine
English.
de Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, que está coorganizando co-auspiciando este webinar.
Catherine is
nos dice,
the director
que gracias, Michael.
Solidarity 2020 and Beyond, one of the co-sponsors of this organization. Her question says, we were glad to have you present at our recent international activist convening in Nepal.
A nivel internacional en Nepal en marzo de 2023.
In March 2023, with Solidarity 2020 and Beyond.
De lo que sepamos, ¿no? Es importante que esta información, esos modelos lleguen al campo para
As we know, getting this information and these models out to the field to be used by activists is the key to more impactful campaigns
y sus
and
campañas
nonviolent
puedan ser
movements.
más efectivos. Entonces,
how can we, the co-sponsors,
la pregunta es la siguiente. ¿Cómo los participantes que están en este webinar y quienes coorganizamos este webinar, cómo podemos ayudar para distribuir esas ideas, para diseminar esas ideas, para distribuir esas tácticas que están en tu libro para que llegue a más gente en el campo. Entonces, ¿qué recomendarías, Michael, para que las ideas tan valiosas, todas esas tácticas variadas que tú mencionas, cómo podemos hacer llegar eso a los activistas en el campo de la mejor forma? Entonces, con esas tres preguntas empezamos. Y ya luego te hago las demás preguntas que nos hicieron llegar a través del chat.
I may have missed something, but I only heard 2 questions. How do we structure a movement in part to protect from retaliation and encourage international support? And then Catherine's question. I didn't hear a third one.
La primera son 2 preguntas.
Oh, because the first one has 2 parts.
Un movimiento desde cero.
How do you structure a movement from scratch?
Okay. Los movimientos se pueden
how do we protect ourselves
de la represión.
Thank you.
Okay. Bueno, empecemos con esas 3, Michael. Adelante.
Great. Well, if I have the complete answers to these questions, we would have all the world's problems figured out and solved. So I would welcome other opinions and ideas on this as well from all of you out there. How do we structure a movement? I think that for most of us, that's too big a question to ask. It's like, how do we structure the climate change movement? It's too big for any one of us to be. We're not the sun god or sun goddess of the universe, and we can just tell the whole, we're not, we're not Greta. We're not in a position to really say, what is the whole movement going to be structured like? What makes more sense for us, of course, we need to pay attention to what the movement is and learn about the movement. But most of us need to get into the mentality of a campaign or a project. What is it that I can do with the community or resources or groups that I am connected with that can come up with a clear goal that is achievable in maybe 6 months to a year or 2 years that we can reach? Many campaigns together become a movement. Many groups together with campaigns become a movement. And so one of the problems with asking too big a question is it can become paralyzing. How do I structure them? I know you weren't trying to be paralyzing, Cecile. It wasn't your purpose. But I really want to encourage people to think more. You think globally, but you act locally. And so structuring your work around a campaign that has a clear goal that you think is achievable with the resources, the groups, and whatever that you work with. Sorry if I talk too quickly. The second part is to protect from retaliation. This is a huge challenge for nonviolent for any activist, whether you're violent or nonviolent. it's a challenge. Clearly, we in the nonviolent universe believe and can see through a lot of data that's been collected by social scientists that nonviolent movements typically have fewer deaths and less repression than violent movements do. It is true that nonviolent action will get a lot of repression, and more repression than if you are a group that does nothing at all. But even in cases where you don't do anything, sometimes the authorities will still beat you and tax you and take your money and treat you badly. So a lot of this protection question you ask about violence is highly contextual compared on the different country that you're in and the different conflict that you're in. So it's very difficult to generalize. Your note about how do we do things that get international support, or how do we use international support to bring some deterrence to the authorities or the corporations? It's a great question. One of the reasons it's a great question is because one of the great things about nonviolent action is that you have the ability to expand the battlefield much more easily than violence. What do I mean by that? I mean that, for example, the people who are in Venezuela or the people who are in Myanmar right now, yes, they are struggling in various ways. It's really helpful for these movements to take the nonviolent struggle all over the world and to fight all over the world, because the governments are not as powerful abroad as they are at home. It's much more difficult to take a guerrilla struggle abroad, because if you start blowing up the embassies or try to use violence abroad, you're not going to get support. You're going to turn off any potential allies. So nonviolent struggle, you can really expand beyond your province, your town, your country in a way that's really important. And getting international support for your cause is something that can be very valuable. Cecile and I have for years sent international people with privilege, often Americans or Europeans, into a conflict to try to protect human rights defenders. We're still trying to do this a little bit in certain places in the world with some limited success, but often the authorities don't even let us in the country. They don't want international eyes to see what's going on or to protect local people. There is a little bit of international digital intervention that we can do with cameras that are being used from abroad, and we can use the internet to let the authorities know that we're watching, that we're texting our colleagues and friends every moment of the day, and FaceTiming together, and even potentially getting a live video of government repression in a particular country. So let's also try to use this indirect digital intervention internationally in a good way. Finally, your question about outreach is a good one. Frankly, people are overwhelmed when I provide a tactical database of 350 tactics. It's too many. It's overwhelming. So I do break it down into a few categories, but it's still a little bit overwhelming for people. And so I don't have all the answers on how to market these ideas, but I do think that helping people understand the dualistic nature of nonviolent action and civil resistance is helpful. It's true that probably 90% of nonviolent action is coercive and confrontational. But the 10% is important, that's persuasive, that uses rewards, that uses cooperation, that is constructive engagement. It's helpful for people to think along these lines, particularly because, as I mentioned earlier, The prefigurative actions are some of the most powerful actions that we have in nonviolent action, have changed the world. Let me give you a couple of examples. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people for the last 50 years have been publicly out and open about their sexuality and their identity. They're not hiding. They are out there expressing themselves. They are marrying the people they want to marry. They are loving the people they want to love publicly. And they are doing this in a way to create the future today. And the society saw this. And yes, there's been resistance, but there's been much change. So they've created the future that they want to live in. They couldn't create the future living in a closet, hidden in a room. It needed to come out into the public view. And this is an example of tremendous nonviolent social change on a massive scale. The women's movement has also done this in many ways. We have the African Americans in the United States that did this in the 1960s, where they sat in lunch counters that were separated because of apartheid. This is also done in South Africa. People refused to cooperate, and they lived the future today. The critical mass riding, bicycle riding I showed was another example. And in the climate change movement, we're going to start needing to do more and more both constructive and confrontational actions. Together, I think we can succeed in changing the world. I hope that answered your question about outreach a little bit, but I welcome ideas on how to do better outreach for this information. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Michael, por estas respuestas
Thank you, Michael, for those responses
que compartes
and
con
inputs that you're sharing
los
with us
participantes.
and with the
Tenemos
participants.
3 preguntas más para
We have
ti.
3 more questions
Entonces
now
voy a hacerlas
for you.
despacito.
So I'm going to
La
go
primera
through
de
them slowly.
María Ceballos
Maria Zavallos is
dice que,
asking,
como tú mismo dijiste, ¿no? Que pudiste observar algunos
as you
mecanismos
yourself
de
said,
difusión
have
que
you been
hacen
able to
que se adopten
observe
algunas tácticas no
mechanisms
violentas
of
de un país al
disseminating or
otro, ¿no? Que,
adopting
por ejemplo, tú
nonviolent
mencionabas el
tactics
cacerolazo,
between
se originó en Chile,
countries, for
pero
example, like the
en
example of the
Birmania,
cacerolazo
en
that you
Myanmar,
gave that was
también
original
se
to
llegó a
Chile, but later was
utilizar.
adopted in other
Entonces,
countries.
¿qué has podido, digamos, observar como
What have you
mecanismos
been
de
able to
difusión
observe
que hacen
as
justamente que esas tácticas que
disseminating
se emplean
tactics
primero en algún país,
from one country
luego
to others,
lleguen a ser usadas por activistas hasta
that
del
they're
otro lado
used
del mundo, ¿no? Como
by
desde Chile a Birmania.
by
Entonces,
activists on other parts of the world?
¿qué mecanismos de difusión, es la pregunta, has podido
What
observar?
mechanisms
¿Sí? Que
of
explican eso.
dissemination have you
Primera
seen?
pregunta.
That's the
Segunda
first question.
pregunta. Te
The second
dice
one,
Rafael
from
Uzcategui de
Rafael
Caracas, de
Uzcategui
Venezuela,
from
que
Caracas,
han
Venezuela.
intentado diferentes estrategias de resistencia creativa
He
y
said,
no
so
violenta desde la
we
sociedad
have tried
civil
different
allá en Venezuela.
strategies
Sin
of
embargo,
creative nonviolent
sienten
resistance
que
within
la
the civil society
legitimidad
here in my country.
internacional
But we feel like there
frente
is
a
an
esas
international
prácticas
legitimacy
tiene
to
una
these
lectura
practices
principalmente
that has
ideológica.
a mostly
Ahí explica
ideological
lo que quiere
component
decir.
to it.
Dice, por ejemplo,
So if
si
the nonviolent
esas
movement is
estrategias
against
se usan
a
contra un gobierno
conservative
conservador o
government
de derecha,
or a
son
right-wing government,
legítimas.
then those movements are
Pero
perceived to be
cuando se
legitimate.
usan contra un
While
gobierno de
when they
izquierda,
take
entre
place
comillas,
against the government
son vistas
so-called
con
of the left,
sospecha y
they're
recelo
seen with
o
suspicion
inclusive
and
abiertamente minimizadas.
they may actually be
Entonces, la
actively and
pregunta
openly
es la
minimized
siguiente.
as not
¿Cómo
being legitimate.
superar la
So
interpretación
how would you
ideologizada
suggest overcoming
de los
this
conflictos?
ideological
Gracias.
interpretation of conflict
Y
and
ahora,
nonviolent
una pregunta
movement?
más,
Thanks.
Michael. Espero que ya te acuerdes
So,
todas.
one more question
En
here.
países con mucha represión, con mucha vigilancia de parte del gobierno,
and this is from an anonymous
cómo los
attendee,
ciudadanos
in repressive
pueden
countries with heavy
utilizar
government
efectivamente
surveillance, how can
tácticas
citizens
como
effectively use tactics such as
los
digital
juegos
games or social
digitales
media
o
to resist and mobilize
las redes
for
sociales
change?
para resistir y movilizarse para el cambio? Esta pregunta me gusta mucho porque yo tenía la misma inquietud.
So I like this
¿Cómo
question because I had the same
justamente
doubt.
para usar efectivamente
How do we
ese
use
ámbito
these
digital cuando
tools
hay
and this
tanto
digital
control
environment
de
as
parte
a
de
tactic
ciertos
of control
gobiernos? Y
facing
ahí
certain
explica
governments?
un poco más la persona
And the person
que está
continues,
anónima,
when
dice
facing a
que
repressive regime that
también
heavily
cuando
monitors
un
public
régimen
gatherings,
represivo
what
monitorea de
alternative
manera
tactics can be employed to
muy
communicate and
cercana
coordinate protests
las
without
reuniones
jeopardizing
públicas,
participants' safety?
¿qué tácticas alternativas pueden ser empleadas para poder comunicar entre activistas y coordinar las protestas sin arriesgar a los participantes? ¿Sí? Me parecen muy interesantes esas preguntas. Yo tengo también
These questions seem very interesting to me. I have them too.
Atenta a tu
I'm
respuesta,
paying attention
Michael.
and looking forward to your answers, Michael.
Fabulous questions. Dissemination of tactical ideas often works through the mainstream news and also through movement news channels. People are hungry for anything that works. So you can see, for example, in Spain in 2010, maybe 11, an Occupy movement started there of sorts against the government. And this was quickly copied in the United States, where the Occupy movement, where the tactic of bringing your tents and camping in a location, in a central location, became very popular and spread like wildfire around the world. People see success and they copy it. And so we saw this in the Arab Spring, where one protest led to the a dictator coming down, and then you had all kinds of other countries where the people came out onto the streets using Facebook and social media to quickly mobilize people in huge numbers so quickly that the governments could not respond. So people are always so hungry to learn about what's going to work. So the ones that seem to work at first spread very quickly. But when a tactic does not succeed at first, it doesn't get publicity, it doesn't get shared. And so that's sometimes sad, because sometimes a tactic might not work in one location and situation, but could work in another. My database here, the tactics database we have, is something we try to do to spread ideas about tactics. There are a few other websites, but honestly, the primary way that we do, other than kind of through the news, is through telling stories. We tell stories about, not usually tactics, but we tell stories about people and campaigns, and the tactics are included in our discussion. But if you have ways, ideas on how these tactics are shared, I would be interested to hear about them and learn about them, because we need to do a better job of sharing tactics around the world. In Venezuela, yes, there is a problem in the United States and in Europe to some degree it's kind of leftist imperialism where, all of the world's problems are caused by the United States, for example, and blamed on the United States. And so this is a bit of an ideological problem that we have. I don't have great answers on this. It is a problem. I think it is also true to say that the world can be understood in somewhat Marxist or classist analysis by showing that 1% of the world's population controls most of the world, and that there is an enormous inequity in rich people around the world controlling most societies. And there are exceptions to this, of course, but this underlying structural issue is drives many movements and many people to automatically support left-wing movements and even totalitarian or authoritarian governments when they shouldn't. So I don't have all the answers for you on this, but I do recognize that it is a problem. And then finally, digital. How do we operate in this contest between the governments and the corporations and ourselves? There's a big contest going on. And frankly, in the last 5 or 10 years, the corporations and the governments have been kicking our butt a lot. We've not had the success in nonviolent struggle in certain respects in the last 10 years that we would like. There's enormous amounts of repression going on. People are fighting back in every possible way they can digitally. And, there are successes here and there, and people are going to continue to resist. At some level, I do have to remind everybody that nonviolent action involves taking risk, and often involves taking sacrifice. And the alternative is to do nothing, be passive. And so part of what has to happen is that people have to remain courageous and be willing to sacrifice and to stand up to repression. And that's very hard to do, particularly in authoritarian societies where they're always trying to keep you separated and atomized, where being in a group is hard to be because they're trying to split up groups and you can't gather in large groups in public. So that the government wants you to be alone. And then when you're alone, it's hard to stand up and be courageous. So again, I don't have all the answers. We can look through hundreds of tactics and see what works in different circumstances. But this issue about, final question around when we gather large peoples in large groups, the government really represses us heavily. How do we find alternatives to that? My suggestion is not to abandon mobilizing altogether in big groups. Mobilizing in big groups is still very important, primarily to show the government that you're not afraid. But you have to be very careful and calculated in your use of that and not overuse it, because it can be demoralizing over time if the government represses very, very greatly and people shut down and stop fighting. So what you want to do is to have some continued efforts at building larger groups and centralization to the best of your ability. But obviously there are many tactics that we call dispersed tactics, decentralized tactics. And one of the things that Gene Sharp emphasized 50 years ago, an underused approach is the use of boycotts, the use of strikes, which particularly often can be done in a very decentralized way, or also can be done in a serial way. One day this city, one day this city, one day this town, and you can keep things moving. So boycotts, strikes are examples of non-cooperation where you withdraw your support, you refuse to do something, and this often can be done in a dispersed way, and it makes it much more difficult for a regime and expensive for a regime to try to track down on lots of people. I don't know if I answered your questions very adequately in the short time I have, but they're brilliant questions, and I'm happy to talk more with any of you about them.
Muchas gracias, Michael. Creo que en honor a tiempo voy a tomar la última ronda de preguntas, si les parece bien. Igual tenemos todavía preguntas muy interesantes de contestar, ¿no? Entonces, la primera pregunta que quiero hacerte, bueno, que viene de un asistente anónimo,
es
¿cuál es o cómo tú ves cómo es el propósito de esos paseos que se hacen en medios alternativos de transporte masa crítica que tú mencionaste en tu presentación como una táctica ¿no? interesante, nueva, actual, ¿no? de resistencia no violenta? ¿Cómo tú ves que ese tipo de paseos, creo que sería la palabra en español, promueven una nueva visión del transporte y cómo en ese sentido encarnan una acción prefigurativa, ¿sí? Porque creo que esa es una muy buena reflexión. Yo creo que también tiene esa característica prefigurativa. Entonces, esa es la primera, o sea, las dos primeras preguntas, really en una respecto a estos paseos en medios alternativos.
Their purpose in promoting a new vision of transportation, and then how do they embody prefigurative action?
Intervención también son dos preguntas en una. Ya te advierto, tal vez tienes que anotar para no olvidar, que es de Silvio Álvarez, que pregunta: ¿cuál es tu percepción sobre las formas de resistencia de los pueblos
what's
indígenas?
Your perception about,
¿Y en qué nivel
forms of resistance by indigenous populations?
What
level are they being incorporated by the academic world?
¿Cómo justamente estas formas de resistencia propias impulsadas por los pueblos indígenas están siendo incorporadas, tomadas en cuenta? ¿Sí? Y finalmente, la última dos preguntas, también dos en una. ¿Considera usar métodos de una sola vez? ¿Has pensado en compartir métodos únicos con movimientos de habla no hispana?
You consider using
y con eso creo que ya cerramos, porque son 6 preguntas, porque cada pregunta eran 2 en una.
Have you thought about
pues, Michael, espero que hayas podido anotar todas. Si hay alguna duda, yo te repito.
That are unique to movements that are not Spanish speaking. So, with those questions, I'll turn over the floor to you.
Michael, ¿pudiste anotar todo esto? Fui muy rápido.
Did you get all that? It was really quick.
I'll try, and I'll try to be respond quickly. The purpose of the critical mass rides is to provide an alternative that is a sustainable, ecologically based alternative to the automobile, because the gas, particularly the petrol automobile, has caused so much carnage and damage to the environment and to the atmosphere. The purpose of having these mass rides is to create an experience of this whole society, or a big part of society, doing something differently. And they're trying to experiment with what the world would look like if it was mostly bicycles and not automobiles. Whether they succeeded in this, I don't know, but this is the intention behind the critical mass ride, and maybe it did not succeed fully in its goal, but this was, I think, what it seeks to do. Sylvia, your question about indigenous resistance and what's the perception of indigenous resistance? Has it been widely recognized? Are there new tactics coming from indigenous peoples that we can learn from? Brilliant question. I think that indigenous peoples have made great progress in the last couple of decades. In many countries, there have been more prominence and attention paid to indigenous peoples than were previously seen. We can look at Australia, we can look at Canada, we can look at parts of South America, the United States, even places in Indonesia, places around the world, even, well, maybe India, we could debate that. So I think there has been some progress. We incorporated in our categories on our database a whole number of new categories that reflected indigenous concerns, including the indigenous cultural arts and norms, the clothes that you or indigenous people wear, the foods that they use or produce, that there is a lot of power and knowledge and use of nonviolent tactics through, again, it's prefigurative. These indigenous people are living the way they always have, but they're trying to really insist on living it openly and proudly in society, and that indigenous people are going to be recognized for these cultural traditions, which become nonviolent tactics because they are a resistance to the dominant society. And so we've incorporated a number of these kinds of resistant tactics that are really just a way of life and the culture of indigenous people, but that they practice these sometimes with great personal sacrifice or group sacrifice and cost. So I'm very hopeful that the indigenous movements of the world, in part, will be heard more and more, particularly around climate chaos, because I think the indigenous voices have not for some kind of quaint, paternalistic kind of, oh, aren't indigenous people nice kind of thing. I think indigenous people generally have answers for today that we need to hear. They're actually living and creating really lovely communities that we need to emulate, that we need to learn about. And I think if the world can listen to indigenous people more and emulate more, we will be in a better place. So thank you, Sylvia, for that phenomenal question. And Salka, it's an honor for me to be on a webinar with Salka Barka, who is a tremendous nonviolent women's activist for the Sahrawi people of Western Sahara. You're a friend, and it's great to get a question from you. I hope everybody on this call will learn about the Western Sahara if you don't already, and talk to Salka here if you want to know anything about Western Sahara or the women's movement of Western Sahara or fighting patriarchy in Western Sahara. She's amazing. I'm not quite sure that I got your question, Salka. You talked about Are there examples of tactics that have been used once and they're fairly unique? There are, and sometimes they're not really worth sharing elsewhere because they don't really work anywhere else. An example of this is the wade-in that in South Africa, when they used to have Africans and Europeans separated, and they couldn't even go into the same ocean together or pool together. And they created the tactic called the wade-in, wading in, meaning going in the water together. We don't really have a situation like this much in the world today. I'm not sure that the wade-in tactic or the swimming together tactic is really going to be used again. It is true we do have some apartheid societies still left in the world. Israel is one, Saudi Arabia and some Muslim countries are another. And some people might refer to some countries, particularly some Muslim countries, but India also, Hindu, as having a lot of gender apartheid. So maybe some of these things where people could swim together might happen again, but there are tactics that are fairly unique to a particular conflict that don't necessarily get used again. And some of them use technologies that aren't used anymore. We used to use fax machines in various ways, nonviolent direct action in fax machines, but we don't have fax machines anymore. So yeah. I hope I answered your question, Salka, and thank you all for these questions. If you have additional ones, I'll share my email and you can send me questions, and to the best of my ability, I will try to answer them. And I would really welcome help in getting out this information and these ideas. And again, thank you, Cecile, and all of you for hosting me.
Muchas gracias, Michael. Y cuando tú estabas contestando esta última pregunta, estaba pensando en
Thank you, Michael. When you were answering this last question, I was thinking about
que ahora me olvide los nombres, pero de pintarse los labios de rojo en Nicaragua. Ahora me olvidé el nombre, se me escapó. Pero bueno, aquí están varios colegas nicaragüenses. Podrían mencionarlo. Creo que este, por ejemplo, es una táctica muy propia del contexto nicaragüense que funcionó muy bien, o sea, fue por lo menos muy visible.
Was very visible,
entonces
but
me parece súper chévere. Le voy a dar ahora Pico Rojo. Gracias, Paola, por recordarme el nombre de la campaña de Pico Rojo en Nicaragua. Bueno, le voy a dar la palabra para finalizar a Belén y luego cerraremos agradeciéndote, Michael, pero primero escuchémosle un ratito a Belén que quiere mencionar algunas cosas antes de cerrar. Belén.
Before closing.
Muchas gracias, Cecil. Sí, efectivamente, quería recordar a todos los participantes del webinar que les invitamos a que visiten nuestro blog Movimiento. En este mes de junio estamos publicando textos sobre violencia digital. Además, les invitamos a participar enviando sus textos sobre nuestra convocatoria actual, Agentes Provocadores e Infiltrados. Por favor, envíe sus propuestas a accionnoviolenta.blog@gmail.com. Bianca ya puso en el chat también. La fecha límite es el 6 de julio. Además, les invitamos a escuchar nuestro canal de podcast, Relatos de la Resistencia Noviolenta, en Spotify y en otros canales. Nuestro último episodio aborda la resistencia no violenta en espacios transnacionales. Y por último, nuestro próximo curso virtual, El Poder de la Gente, la Dinámica Estratégica de la Resistencia No Violenta, tendrá lugar el 4 de octubre, del 4 de octubre al 29 de noviembre del 2023. Las aplicaciones se abren en agosto del 2023.
We'd also remind
pues claro,
and invite people to participate in the upcoming course
en Facebook, Twitter
in
y Instagram
October
para que estén
4th through
al día en
November
todas las
19th.
publicaciones
It's a virtual course called Power of the People,
muchas gracias, Michael,
Strategic Dynamics of Nonviolent Resistance.
Bueno, muchas gracias,
applications will
Belén.
open in August 2023, and we'd also invite everyone to follow our social network.
Michael presenta su
on
libro
Facebook, Twitter, and
a una
Instagram.
audiencia hispanohablante, así que yo creo que todos, ahí hablo no solamente del programa regional del Instituto Regional, como también de los otros, las otras organizaciones que coauspician este webinar. Es un honor para todos pues, poder organizar por primera vez esa presentación del libro ante una audiencia hispanohablante. Quiero agradecer en particular toda la labor de nuestros colegas intérpretes, porque la verdad que no es fácil. También, por supuesto, a todos los participantes por sus excelentes preguntas. Michael les dejó sus datos de contacto. También pusimos varias veces en el chat la dirección, el enlace para acceder a la base de datos que construyó la organización dirigida por Michael, Noviolentas International. Creo que no pusimos, no sé si alguien me puede ayudar antes de que cerremos, no pusimos el link de la versión en español del libro de Michael. Creo que habría sido bueno. Ahora me acuerdo, creo que podríamos ponerlo antes de cerrar este webinar. Y pues muchísimas gracias nuevamente a todos. Muchísimas gracias, Michael. Esperamos tenerte nuevamente para otro webinar, para seguir colaborando contigo y con todas las organizaciones que organizan este evento. Así que muchas gracias a todos y una feliz tarde.
Thanks everyone and have a wonderful afternoon.